You've heard a lot of interesting material from very differing perspectives. The underlying purpose of this forum is very much about, if you like, if I can use a slightly inelegant term, spreading the virus. This is about how do you take what quite clearly is a very powerful set of tools and concepts and actually spread them institutionally in a way which actually does make a difference to outcomes. One's got to draw a distinction between process and the outcome that you get, whether it's in government, whether it's in companies, whether it's in NGOs, educational institutions, health education and health deliverers. But really what we're trying to do is, I think what we've drawn on are really very good examples of pretty close to best practice. What we now like to do is get a download from you in terms of a feedback about what you've heard, and most importantly, from our perspective, to actually understand what you think needs to be done, how one would be in action to actually spread that virus and make these powerful tools much more widely available in Australia. To do that, I'm going to hand over the last session to another Australia 21 director, Lynn Stevens, who's going to take us through the next half an hour. We promise we will get you out the door, given it's 3:30 it's 3 o'clock and on a long weekend, on a Friday in Melbourne. But we'll get you out of the door by 3:30. But this is a very important session. In terms of mechanics, everything that you say, if you use a microphone, will be recorded, and we want to capture it. So I would ask, I'll walk around with the microphone, and so will Claire over here. But hold your thought and feedback to Lynn until you've got a microphone in front of you. Otherwise, we won't be able to capture what you said. Lynn, over to you.
Okay, everyone, I can see some people looking quite tired, and it's been a very rich day. It's been fantastic. So you'll be pleased to know that I'm not going to add any more content except to tell you a little bit about what we're thinking about as next steps, and I'll do that a bit later. But this is actually your session. And what I'm going to suggest that you do is that you take just a minute or two to quietly reflect on the whole day. I mean, think back to the beginning, things that have struck you, questions you may have had, ideas that may have come to you. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to just be silent and to go inside yourself. Okay, just take a few seconds to come back into the room. And I was going to ask you to actually pair up with someone near you. Some people may need to move a little bit and just have a brief conversation about what's come up today for you and any ideas you may have about how you'd like to see this go forward. So we just take about 5 minutes. So if you could just find a partner. That was very interesting. That was extremely interesting to watch from here and very energetic. And I wondered if some of you might like to share some of that conversation now with the larger group, both in terms of reflections or ideas about where we might take this next. So who'd like to go first?
Where's the problem?
Yeah, and I do have to apologise to the two people that I'm with, because I think I took over most of the session. But I publish a magazine, and I have been for 14 years, and I've been to a lot of conferences and events, and I think thank you very much. And sometimes I think you really need to get champions for a cause, and I really think we need to get, like with Beyond Blue, when Gary McDonald sort of stepped out, and I really think, and the lady next to me said, yes, but it's more important to actually just do it. But it's about that whole thing about you can take a horse to water, but how do you make them drink?
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that. We're recording all of this so that we can capture these ideas.
Right at the back here.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, when I was listening to Lynn Reader's presentation about empathic conversations and the way in which people can quite quickly come to understand people very different to them. What it reminded me of was what I know about citizens' juries and mechanisms like that, and which is that quite quickly mortal political enemies don't necessarily change their position, but come to understand that people who disagree with them do so for legitimate reasons. And throughout the day, it has struck me that the sort of things we're talking, what we haven't talked about is what's pushing us constantly away from the directions that we've been exploring today. And our structures of management, the economy and politics all push away from that. And perhaps to some extent that is their role. Because I think there's, there is a balance between, as I said in my presentation, between competition and cooperation. But it led me to believe, I've become, just in the last few years, a very strong supporter of deliberative democracy, things like citizens' juries, to the extent that I'd be quite happy to, this is actually unconstitutional, by the way, but I would be quite happy to have the Senate chosen by lot. I think it would be, and the fact that we've had these micro parties in the Senate, which everybody regards as a disgrace to our system, well, in fact, they might be pretty odd people, but they've been people who've turned up and judged a lot of these things on their merits, and guess what? They've come to pretty good conclusions. So I would, so there's, A, I think we would get better decisions, but B, we would have a stronger confrontation between these two sides of our nature, the competitive side and the compassionate and solidaristic side. And I don't have a great, I guess I want to see the pendulum swing more towards cooperation and solidarity, pretty obviously in a bunch of areas I could mention, greenhouse and asylum seekers, my father having been one. But I don't think that the world will become utopia simply by throwing the switch all the way in that direction. So those are my thoughts, which I'm disguising as coming out of the conversation between me and my friend here. But in fact, he just got the same sort of lecture that I've given you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Just a couple of comments. It was said before about mindfulness, empathy and compassion as if being different things. I don't think the thing is to teach mindfulness without compassion or to teach it with it. I think is to teach mindfulness in the broadest sense of the word, in a much more holistic way, so that it couldn't possibly be removed from compassion and empathy, because to define mindfulness in a very, very narrow way makes it seem as if it's different to those other things, and that's not really mindful. That's kind of perhaps a kind of focus, but it's not mindfulness in the fuller sense of the word. So I just think we need a very broad sense of it. The other thing that I just wanted to mention is what I sometimes call the 4 Fs, but being faithful to the philosophy but flexible with the form of how mindfulness is introduced or developed, that we can be so flexible with it that we unhinge ourselves from the very core principles of the philosophy of mindfulness, and we don't want to do that. So if teaching it need to be faithful to the philosophy, the philosophical underpinnings of it, but to be very flexible with the form. It's not like there's only one way to teach mindfulness and it has to be absolutely in this structured course and this way, this many weeks, this many hours. There are an infinite number of ways it can be introduced. So I think there are some of the things, because sometimes if we get fixated on the form, you can sometimes not be adaptable and adapt it to the context and the needs and the opportunity that's there. And so we can sometimes, I think, be very fixated and inflexible with the form, and sometimes we can be so flexible with the philosophy that we unhinge ourselves from the actual deeper philosophical underpinnings. We don't have to always talk about the deeper philosophical underpinnings, but I think we need to be faithful to them and very much have them in mind and heart when teaching mindfulness.
Thank you, Craig. One here, and then the gentleman in the purple shirt.
Thank you. I was just sharing with my friend here. I'm one of those bad people who has the iPad here, and when you refer to a report, I find it while we're talking. And I went and found the Mindful Nation report, and if I could commend, when you open up a report from a parliamentary party, usually you'll find, 70 or 100 recommendations. And what's really refreshing in the practical approach, the strategic approach of this, there are 12. And they're very strategic. And I would, in terms of Australia 21 trying to influence policymakers, this is an admirable model for foot in the door type recommendations that seem to me very easy to adopt. And that's very impressive for me from a real world approach to getting people who are overwhelmed with recommendations.
Thank you. I agree totally with you.
Hi, my name is Gerald Freb. I'm a long-term meditator and a social cause communication practitioner and lecturer. The thing that really struck me about today that I think has been really interesting coming to this microcosm here has been, for me, the reflection on the need for a mindful culture. And what I've heard here today is the sort of seeds of that in different ways. And I think that's very encouraging, and I think that's what's really necessary, and we as Westerners are capable of creating in this modern era.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just down the front here.
I'm going to be deliberately controversial just to see what happens and say I don't really want a mindful nation or a mindful culture. I want a compassionate one. And I like what you said, Craig, about a broad definition of mindfulness, but I think that within mindfulness practice, compassion needs to be made explicit, so that we are actually, what's mindfulness in service of? Is it just inner peace, or is it in service of greater compassion towards oneself and greater compassion in decisions that we make? And I think that we actually need to move the rhetoric on beyond mindfulness, that it's not just, mindfulness doesn't achieve anything in terms of change. It opens the door to it, yes, but it doesn't necessarily create outcomes that are more compassionate unless we are shaping the conversation, the practices in that way. And I think that there's, emerging practices, and, the Tibetan Buddhist practices of compassion are coming into the West in different forms, in forms that are more packaged towards a Western mindset. And I think this conference has been about mindfulness, empathy and compassion, and I think we need to bring them together more. It's not just that we have compassion cultivation dyads, as per one of our speakers, and we have mindfulness practice. I think we need to be saying that mindfulness is in service of something, and that there can be particular conversations about about the blocks to compassion and how we use mindfulness to overcome those blocks.
Thank you.
So, sorry, Lynn, I was just going to say thanks, Petrina, for that comment. And I couldn't agree more that really it is not an end in itself. It's like for what purpose? And when we did our empathy report, that's why it was a multidisciplinary report. So it was based on neuroscience and management theory, but also evolutionary biology. And when we talk about what are the pushes, what's pushing us away from empathy? A lot of the work that's being done now, say for example, just last year, anthropologists are telling us that human beings became the top predator, first time in evolution. So, and a lot of the issues around evolution is that, as a species, we survived because we gathered together. So we belong in groups. And part of that, then we moved into tribes, and so it's the tribal nature of our need to belong that we need to shift, and so that's why I think that some of this work is really as much about how we're evolving as it is about, you know, as I say, particular practices. So, yeah, they're the main things I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay. So we've got one more. Are there any other? I'm just thinking in terms of time and.
I was going to.
Okay, so.
Can I? I had a response to her, and then if you had something
we'll go
further.
to you, then Liz, and then one other, and then we probably need to. But I'll just say to you that we are actually going to send you out an evaluation where you can add more comments if you wish. So if you haven't had a chance today, or you're one of those people who thinks about things, you will have another opportunity.
Yeah, I had a response also to your controversial comment, as you put it, and in a sense it echoes what Craig was saying, and I was really struck that there are many different understandings, I think, of what mindfulness is. We're using it in lots of different ways, and certainly for me, and I think this is backed up by the science as well, mindfulness is not just about the mind, it's certainly an opening of the mind and the heart to whatever is here. And I think it is absolutely the very act of mindfulness that shows there are brain scans, and Craig can probably quote more eloquently than me on the insula, which is part of the brain associated with empathy just by virtue of doing the practice. There's more neuronal activity there, and empathy increases by virtue of doing the practice. But if you, even going away from the science, in Pali, which was the traditional kind of language, mindfulness was translated as heartfulness. It's absolutely about being with in a very open-hearted way. And even if you think of the lived experience, I'm not sure if you practice mindfulness or not, but part of the beautiful but most difficult thing I think about being a mindfulness practitioner is you have to learn to be with yourself in all the different states, in all your different moments, including the moments, the bits you don't like about yourself, the horrible bits, the cruel bits. You know, we heard stuff about kindness, but what about when unkindness arises? How do we actually be with ourselves? And it's through knowing, I think there's a real honesty to mindfulness practice. That's why I love it, because it's really about having to be with yourself in all of the moments. And it's the empathy and the compassion. If you can open your heart, that's what helps you get closer to those states. And then through knowing that in yourself and how that arises and further insights come, etc., etc. But the more you can be with and make space for that in yourself, the more you can be with and tolerate that in others. So I think the mindfulness, the compassion, the empathy, they're all one and the same in a sense. But I think this really depends on how you're being taught mindfulness or how it's being used, because certainly I know in MBSR, Peace in a Frantic World, that's certainly very much the way. Yeah.
Thanks. Liz.
Yes, I'm not quite sure exactly what I'm saying, but I guess I agree that I think mindfulness, I mean, it's a practice, it's a tool, it's extraordinarily useful for looking at stress reduction, which means it's really good for decreasing psychological distress. And we know that a lot of the health problems and mental health problems are now being linked through to stress-related disorders, through malfunction or dysfunction of the immune system. So it's a really useful thing to have, but we also have to be really careful how we balance it out, because there's a lot of businesses now who bring in mindfulness practice and they're doing it for all the wrong reasons, rather than actually reducing the overload of their staff or fixing the structures that lead to stress. They're actually going, well, now we'll just give you a mindfulness thing, and it's all back on the individual. So I think part of the real challenge is to change the culture by actually saying that mindfulness is a tool that can be useful in situations, but really what we need to do is change our structures and our organisations to be more human, both for the people who work in them and also the people who are served by them with their clients or customers, or, whether it's our government coming up with policies. So it's actually part of a larger thing. So mindfulness, compassion and empathy are part of the bigger picture, but it's coming down to what society do we want to live in, how do we want to be, what relationships do we want to have, and what do we want to value?
Could I ask you please to be as quick as you can?
I just want to follow on from that, and I agree completely. I think that I do support the idea that we have to have an explicit conversation about compassion. I think it is inherent in the practice of mindfulness. But with compassion, we can then become more aware of the suffering. Mindfulness is a foundational skill and an awareness that allows us to contain that suffering and be with it, as mentioned. But I really think we need to be aware of the suffering that is occurring in our institutions, in healthcare and education, in our human race and our global situation. So I'm just wanted to follow on from everything that's said. Thank you.
Yes, just a quick comment to say that I concur with what Craig was saying about being committed to the deeper philosophical aspects of it, and the comment from the person over this other side of the room, that my understanding of mindfulness is that the foundations of mindfulness are compassion, kindness, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And that's my understanding of mindfulness, not just attention.
Thank you. This will be the last. You have the last word.
I was just going to refer back to something that Chris said also. I think context is probably everything. And although I agree compassion is absolutely what we are lacking, if you go up to Parliament House and say to parliamentarians, listen, we're going to teach you some compassion, you're not going to get very far because they all think they're compassionate. So, but giving them a practice which will enable them to exercise muscles which will lead to greater compassion is perhaps the way to go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think that little session just added so much to the whole day. And so I really do thank you all very much for that. I've got a couple of just small announcements, and then I just want to express some appreciation to people who've helped make this day possible. I think, as Lynn has mentioned, we will be writing a summary of today to go with the work that Lynn's already done, and Lynn and Liz will be presenting that material to the Empathy 3 conference at Oxford University in July, so you will have made a contribution to that. As well, we'll have an audio recording of the sessions up on our website as soon as possible. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out an evaluation to you, so please feel free to add any other comments you want to. But I also have an announcement from Kylie Marks, who wasn't able to join us today, who is from Empathy Nation. And Empathy Nation wants to host a breakfast in 2 weeks' time on the 24th down here for people who might like to get together again to have a conversation about empathy, compassion and mindfulness in a more informal setting. And so we will provide some more information about that for you as well. So I think, yeah, I think the other thing that a few people have talked about is maybe we need to stay connected. You know, this could be another way to start moving everything forward. So we've been thinking about a loose network of people interested in this topic. So we might talk to you about that again when we send out the email, but I hope you might be interested to join that. So, Lynn, I don't think there's anything else on the sort of housekeeping, is there? Okay. Well, look, there's a very long list of people to thank. It'll be a little bit like the Oscars, but I really want to do it if you don't mind. I want to thank Melbourne Uni, who made this venue available for us, and the wonderful IT support. So thank you, Jason. Also to Sane for helping connect us internationally to people who've, I think, added a lot to the day. As Lynn has mentioned, there's been a working group that has worked with her on her project, and I particularly wanted to also thank David Morowitz, who provided financial support through the Social Justice Fund and Australian Communities Foundation, and also, and also a lot of other kind of support that's been very valuable to us. As well, I'd like to thank Mike Waller, who's been on his feet all day and kept us on time very, very well, and introduced people. I'd like to thank Rebecca Bunn, our representative of Young Australia 21, our youth wing, who provide enormous two-way mentoring to us. So thank you very much, Rebecca, for coming. And finally, I'd like to thank you guys. So thank you so much. And also, of course, all of our speakers. So maybe we could just finish off with a round of applause for our speakers. And for ourselves. So thanks a lot.